Woman who was trapped in a locker for over 60 hours in high school. When I was in high school, my boyfriend and I would sometimes play innocent pranks on each other. He liked to scare me with spiders the most. I usually just hid someplace and popped out to scare him. Nothing really serious, just simple fun pranks. Every Friday I would meet him by his locker after school and we would leave together and hang out. His last class was gym and he'd usually show up at his locker about 15 minutes after school ended because he always took a shower after gym on days that he was going to spend time with me after school. I should also mention that his locker was on the second floor towards the middle of the hallway and there were stairs at both ends. This will matter later in the story. So while waiting for him to show up, I came up with an idea to prank him. In high school I was short and I still am. So I got the idea to hide inside of his locker and scare him when he showed up. No one else was around since it was Friday and about 10 minutes after school had ended, so I could easily get in his locker and no one would see me. So I unlocked his lock, opened the door and got inside, taking the lock inside with me. After a minute I realized that he might get suspicious that his lock wasn't on the door, so I quickly opened the door, which was easy to do from the inside, just lifting the inside of the handle. I then slipped the lock into the hole in the handle, closed it and pulled the door shut. I wasn't afraid of small spaces and since the locker had slots in the door I could breathe just fine. So I waited, giggling to myself about how bad I was about to scare him. One thing I noticed quickly was that I had no clue how much time was passing. Once I was inside I couldn't tell if 1 minute or 5 minutes had passed. I lost all sense of time while inside there. So I waited and waited. At first I wasn't worried. I figured he had just become distracted by something or someone and he would show up soon. I was starting to get uncomfortable so I kind of slouched down and leaned my head against the locker door. I listened quietly for him to show up. I heard footsteps every now and then, but remained quiet so I wouldn't be heard by anyone who wasn't my boyfriend, like a teacher or another student. I also didn't want my boyfriend to hear me in there when he came to his locker. It was warm and dark in the locker and I normally took a nap after school, so sometime while waiting I fell asleep. I don't know how much time had gone by, but when I woke up it was totally dark. This happened in the winter time so it did get dark outside early, but there were also no lights on in the hallway. At first I was confused. I didn't realize where I was at first. Then the reality of what was going on hit me. If all of the lights were off and it was dark outside, then that meant there was no one inside the school. It was closed up for the night and I was trapped inside my boyfriend's locker. Even worse, no one knew I was in there and it was a Friday. My only hope was that a janitor would be working during the night and would be able to rescue me. Even though there was little chance that anyone was still around, I still started shouting for help. Surely someone would have noticed that I was missing. My parents must have called the police by now and there must be a search party looking for me. Hours felt like days. I thought I was going to die in there. I spent the night screaming for help, crying and trying to kick the locker open, but by morning I was still trapped. My voice was mostly gone by this point and I had wet myself several times. I was tired, sore, hungry, thirsty, hot, sweaty and scared. At least I could finally see since the sun had come up and light was shining into the hallway and into the slots on the locker door. It wasn't much light, but it was better than the total darkness of the night. I waited and listened for the sound of anyone in the hallway. I wouldn't be able to yell for help very well since my voice was gone, but I'd be able to kick the locker and make a lot of noise. My clothing was really uncomfortable by this point and my feet were killing me from standing all night. I was wearing a sweater over a turtleneck, jeans and sneakers. I first slipped my sneakers off to see if that would help my feet feel better, but the cold metal floor was just hard and cold against my bare feet. So I slipped my shoes back on. My jeans were wet. I wanted them off, but even if I could get them off in such a small space, that would leave me standing there half naked when I was rescued. So I just unfastened them and slipped them down just a little to try to get the wet material away from my skin. I tried to get the sweater off because it was making me really hot, but it just wasn't possible in the tiny space I had to move around in. I was so thirsty and hungry by this point. With great effort I was able to turn my body around to face the back of the locker. I then tried reaching up onto the bookshelf above me to see if my boyfriend had left anything to eat or drink. Unfortunately I was only able to slip my fingers between the shelf and door. I could only feel books. It turned out that there was nothing to eat or drink up there anyway. So then again with great effort I turned around to face the door. Saturday went by and I heard nothing. I still banged the locker door every now and then just in case I missed the sound of people. I slept some of the time, but I tried to stay awake the best I could. I didn't want to sleep and miss my chance of hearing someone who was looking for me. After a lot more crying and trying to escape I eventually gave up hope. It was getting dark outside again. I expected to die that night. I was too tired to fight it anymore and I gave up. I fell asleep again. When I woke up it was still dark and I was still trapped. The rest of the night and all of Sunday was about the same. I called for help somewhat and slipped in and out of consciousness. When I cried there were no more tears and I was no longer peeing myself. I was dehydrated. When night finally came Sunday evening I began to have hope again. It had been 2 full days by this point. I only had 1 night left and if I survived I would be released Monday morning. That night I didn't even bother trying to escape or calling for help. I just tried to sleep. Sometime during the night I woke up and couldn't sleep anymore. So I just waited for the first sound of people. I figured the janitor would be the first person I would hear when he came in to turn on the lights. Eventually the sun came up and shortly afterwards the hallway lights turned on. I pulled my jeans back into place so I wouldn't be exposed. That was an awful feeling, cold wet jeans against my you-know-what. I started calling for help in my hoarse voice and kicking the locker. No one came. Then sometime later I heard someone in the hallway. I once again called for help and kicked the locker. It was a teacher. He came to the locker and started talking to me. I told him I had been trapped since Friday and really wanted out. He told me he would go get help and would be right back. A few minutes later the principal and janitor showed up and the janitor cut the lock and I was free. I was then taken to the hospital where I stayed until the next day. I was of course dehydrated. I had a broken toe from kicking the locker, bruises on my hands from hitting the locker and rashes from wearing urine-soaked jeans. I stayed home from school the rest of the week. As for what had taken place outside while I was trapped, my boyfriend came looking for me like always, about 15 minutes after school had ended. He came to the top of the steps, looked down the hallway and didn't see me. He waited at the top of the steps to see if I would show up. He could see down to his locker and to the other stairway. After waiting for me for about 10 minutes he figured that I must have left, so he left and went home. Unfortunately for me he didn't need to get anything out of his locker that day because he had done most of his homework during study hall and already had what he needed to take home with him already. That is something I should have thought about because about half of the time we would meet at his locker he wouldn't even open it. After school the janitors swept the hallways, cleaned the bathrooms and took out the trash. The upstairs hallway wasn't very big, it only had 6 classrooms and 1 boys and 1 girls bathrooms. He said that it only takes them about 20 minutes to clean it and that Friday they had cleaned it about a half an hour after school had ended. They said they never heard me inside the locker. It must have been when I had fallen asleep or when I was trying to not be noticed. My parents weren't worried about me until Sunday evening. The reason was because I had recently asked them if it was okay for me to have a 2-night sleepover at my friend's house for her birthday. I was going to go there right after school to help set up for the party on Saturday, spend the night, go to the party Saturday, help clean up and stay the night again. It was actually a month away, but neither of my parents remembered the date I had asked about or the name of my friend, so they figured that the sleepover was that weekend and since they didn't know which friend they didn't know who to call to check up on me. Then when I wasn't home Sunday evening they started to worry. My mom started calling my friends and finally found out that the sleepover wasn't until the next month. None of my friends had seen me and she checked with my boyfriend who also hadn't seen me. It was around 7 p.m. Sunday evening when she called the police. They came to the house and took the report. They started searching for me, but their search didn't make it to the school before the teacher found me.